The night had a strange stillness, the kind that only comes when a city exhales after a long day. Downtown Los Angeles shimmered under a blanket of drizzle, the streets painted with reflections of neon signs and distant headlights. Keanu Reeves walked quietly through it all, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his long black coat. His steps were unhurried, his head bowed slightly, not to hide his face, but because he preferred to see the world this way, through the calm blur of motion and light. He had finished another long day on set, hours of pretending to be someone else, and now, in the cool silence of the midnight streets, he could simply be. No cameras, no expectations, just the echo of his own footsteps and the whisper of the rain. As he turned the corner of a narrow street lined with small cafes and shuttered art galleries, a sense of nostalgia began to stir in him, a soft ache that had no clear name. These were the kind of streets he used to wander when he first came to Hollywood, young and broke, chasing roles that barely paid for rent. He remembered sleeping on friends' couches, writing poetry on napkins, and playing a beat-up guitar late at night when loneliness pressed too close. The city had changed since then, but something about it still spoke to the same quiet part of him, the one that never stopped searching for meaning in small, ordinary moments. The rain thickened to a mist, curling around the edges of street lamps and halos of taxi lights. Keanu stopped outside a bookstore he used to visit in the 90s, now closed, replaced by a boutique that sold overpriced vinyl records. He gave a faint smile, the kind that barely reached his eyes, and then kept walking. The distant hum of traffic grew softer, replaced by something else, something fragile, a melody. At first, it was so faint he thought it was memory playing tricks, the way a scent or a sound can resurrect ghosts. But as he walked farther down the street, it grew clearer, a guitar, finger-picked gently, the kind of sound that carries pain wrapped in beauty. He slowed his pace, listening. The notes were simple, imperfect, yet they held emotion in every vibration. Then he heard it, the chorus, familiar, undeniable. No one's gonna love you more than I do. His breath caught. That song. He hadn't heard it in years. It was her favorite, Jennifer's. The woman he had once planned to marry, the woman he had lost before they could build a life together. That song had played the night before the accident, on a small speaker in their kitchen, as they danced barefoot on the tiles. Her laughter, soft and warm, still haunted the edges of his memory. Keanu stopped walking completely. He turned toward the sound, following it down a narrow alley lit by a single, flickering streetlight. There, under the weak glow, sat a young street musician. He couldn't have been more than 25, his clothes damp, his shoes worn thin, his guitar old and scarred but alive in his hands. A small crowd of 2 or 3 people stood nearby, quietly listening. The musician's eyes were closed as he played, lost in the song, unaware of who was standing at the edge of the shadows watching him. Keanu's face softened. He had heard perfect renditions of this song in studios and soundtracks, but this one, raw and cracked with emotion, felt truer. It was the kind of music that wasn't played for fame or money, but for survival. The streetlight above them flickered again, casting Keanu's face briefly in golden light before returning to shadow. He stood there, unmoving, the rain pattering gently against his shoulders. For a moment, the world shrank to that single patch of pavement, one man remembering, another creating. The melody drifted like smoke, curling through the night air, touching something sacred. Keanu's throat tightened. The song wasn't just a reminder of love lost, it was a reminder of why he still walked these streets, why he still sought out silence in a noisy world. It was a reminder that beauty, no matter how painful, was always worth finding again. When the song ended, the small crowd clapped softly, dropping a few coins into the guitar case. The musician looked up and smiled shyly, brushing rain from his hair. Keanu lingered for a second longer, his heart still caught between the past and the present. Then, quietly, he stepped forward, not as a movie star, not as a legend, just as a man moved by a song. The rain eased, as if giving space to what was about to unfold. And so began a night that neither of them would ever forget. The young musician's fingers lingered on the final chord, letting it hum through the cool night air like a heartbeat that refused to fade. He opened his eyes slowly, his gaze lifting to the small group of people who had gathered, all offering polite smiles and quiet claps before continuing on their way. When the last of them had gone, only one figure remained under the faint orange halo of the streetlight. The man stood still, half hidden in the mist, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. The musician didn't recognize him at first. All he saw was a stranger in a long coat, the rain catching in his hair, his eyes distant and thoughtful. The stranger looked as if he had stepped out of another time, calm, grounded, yet carrying the kind of sadness that only life could carve. Keanu Reeves took a few steps closer, his boots splashing lightly through shallow puddles. The musician smiled, trying to break the silence. "Hey, man, you like Band of Horses." His voice carried the hoarse exhaustion of someone who had been playing for hours. Keanu's lips curved into a small smile, the kind that said more than words. "Yeah," he replied softly. "That song, it means a lot to me." He paused, glancing down at the guitar, then back up at the musician. "You played it beautifully." The younger man's face lit up, the compliment cutting through his fatigue. "Thanks. It's one of my favorites too. Got me through some rough nights." Keanu nodded slowly, the rain trailing down the side of his face, catching in the lines that years of quiet grief had drawn. "It got me through some too," he murmured. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city, car horns, passing chatter, the hum of a bus engine, all seemed to fade, leaving only the low hum of electricity from the streetlight above. There was something powerful in the stillness between them, a shared understanding that didn't need to be explained. It wasn't about fame or money or the kind of success that headlines talk about. It was about two people connected by something far more fragile, the way music can heal, or at least hold together the broken parts long enough to breathe again. The musician sat down again on the crate that served as his stool, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You play?" he asked, half joking. Keanu looked at the guitar, then at him, as though weighing the question not for its words but for its meaning. "A little," he said finally, with a modest shrug. The musician chuckled. "Well, she's not much, but she still sings," he said, lifting the guitar slightly. "Wanna give her a go?" He had no idea who he was talking to. No clue that the man in front of him was a world-famous actor whose face had been on screens across the planet. To him, Keanu was just another stranger with kind eyes and quiet energy. Keanu hesitated for a moment, then knelt down beside him. "May I?" he asked, his tone soft, almost reverent. The musician nodded and handed over the guitar carefully, as though passing something sacred. Keanu took it in both hands, feeling the worn wood, the uneven strings, the life that had passed through it. He sat cross-legged on the curb, cradling the instrument the way one might hold a fragile memory. He strummed once, testing the sound. It was imperfect, one string slightly out of tune, but it didn't matter. What came next wasn't about perfection. When he began to play, the music came slowly, almost uncertainly at first. His fingers were stiff. It had been years since he had played like this, but the rhythm returned, muscle memory guided by emotion. He didn't play the full song, just the verse, quiet and raw, his voice low and steady. "No one's gonna love you more than I do." The streetlight flickered again, and for a fleeting second, the musician could see his own reflection in Keanu's eyes, that same blend of hurt and hope. It felt like the world had paused. The rain slowed, falling in silver lines that shimmered under the light, and the air grew thick with something invisible but deeply felt. A couple walking by stopped mid-step, whispering to each other. Another person across the street turned their head, then raised a phone hesitantly. The musician didn't care. He just watched as this quiet stranger poured his soul into every note. The way Keanu played wasn't about skill, it was about honesty. Every strum carried weight, every word trembled with something unspoken. When the final note faded, he exhaled slowly, lowering the guitar as if letting go of a memory he had carried for far too long. The musician blinked, trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Man," he said quietly, shaking his head, "you sing like you've lived that song." Keanu gave a faint smile, handing back the guitar. "Maybe I have," he said, almost to himself. The younger man laughed softly, unaware of how true that was. "You're really good. You ever play for people?" he asked. Keanu's smile widened just a little, the ghost of irony passing through his eyes. "Once in a while," he said, standing up and brushing off his coat. Before the musician could respond, a small group began to form. People who had noticed, phones now out, the murmurs spreading. One of them whispered, "Wait, is that Keanu Reeves?" The musician froze, turning his head sharply. He looked back at Keanu, the black coat, The familiar face, the calm, humble smile. His eyes widened in disbelief. "No way," he breathed. Keanu chuckled softly, lowering his voice. "It's okay," he said. "Let's just keep it about the music, yeah?" The musician nodded quickly, still stunned, as a few people clapped gently from across the street. Keanu took a step back, but his eyes lingered on the musician, that same look of respect he'd give another actor on stage, someone who just bared their soul. "You've got something special," he said quietly. "Don't stop playing, no matter how hard it gets." The musician swallowed, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "That means more than you know." Keanu gave one last nod, the kind that felt like a silent blessing, and began to turn away. The rain started again, light and rhythmic, as though the sky itself had been waiting for the cue. The musician stared after him, his fingers still resting on the strings, his heart racing with disbelief and awe. He didn't know yet that this brief encounter, this quiet moment on a forgotten street, would soon reach millions of hearts around the world. But for now, it was just two men, one song, and the sound of rain washing gently over a city that had just witnessed something extraordinary. The rain had turned to a delicate drizzle, glistening under the amber hue of the streetlight. The musician still sat frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Keanu Reeves, the man whose name echoed across generations, whose face had graced countless screens, had just played his guitar like a humble stranger, right there in the middle of an empty city street. It wasn't the fame that shook him, though. It was the sincerity. The way Keanu had played, not for attention, not for validation, but with the kind of raw emotion that only someone who had lived deeply could express. The young man felt his throat tighten. Something about that performance had reached into his chest and stirred something old and aching. He looked down at the guitar, then up at Keanu, who now stood quietly with his hands in his coat pockets, gazing toward the dark sky as if listening for something only he could hear. "You really meant that song, didn't you?" the musician finally said, his voice soft, uncertain. Keanu looked at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he replied. "It was someone's favorite once." His tone was gentle, but beneath it lay layers of memory, loss, love, and quiet acceptance. The musician nodded slowly, as though understanding something unspoken. "Music does that," he said. "It keeps people alive, even when they're gone." Keanu's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, he looked almost fragile, not as an actor or icon, but as a man who had lost too much and somehow found peace in the silence that followed. Keanu took a few steps closer, his gaze dropping to the guitar again. "Mind if we play one more?" he asked. The musician blinked, startled. "You mean, together?" Keanu gave a quiet nod, his expression calm but warm. The younger man hesitated for only a moment before smiling, wide and genuine. "Yeah, I'd like that." He adjusted his seat, scooting over to make room. Keanu sat down beside him on the curb, the city lights stretching across wet pavement behind them like scattered stars. A small crowd began to gather again, a couple of late-night wanderers, a taxi driver on break, two women holding umbrellas who stopped mid-conversation. The musician began strumming first, slow and steady, his fingers trembling slightly. Keanu joined in a beat later, his rhythm imperfect but full of heart. Their notes merged, weaving together into something raw and beautiful. The two of them sang quietly, voices blending, one seasoned by time and sorrow, the other bright with youth and hope. It wasn't a performance meant to impress, it was a conversation between souls. The rain added its own percussion, a soft tapping against the pavement, each droplet like a heartbeat in the silence between verses. People began to lift their phones, recording, but even through their screens they could feel something rare, authenticity. Keanu's expression shifted as he sang, not dramatic or rehearsed, but deeply human. His voice cracked once on a note, and the musician picked it up seamlessly, covering the moment with warmth. The small audience felt the intimacy of it, the way two strangers could find connection through a song that held pain, love, and healing all at once. The energy around them shifted, even the air seemed charged with a quiet reverence. When the last chord faded, no one clapped immediately. The sound hung there, suspended like mist, too sacred to disturb. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause grew, not loud or frantic, but gentle, like rain on rooftops. Keanu gave a small, grateful nod to the onlookers, then turned to the musician and said, You've got a real gift. Don't ever trade it for something hollow." The musician laughed softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man, coming from you, that means everything." Keanu smiled, standing slowly and brushing off his coat. The young man reached out instinctively. "Hey, wait, I never got your name." Keanu looked back, eyes glinting with that familiar kindness. "It's Keanu," he said simply. The musician chuckled, almost embarrassed. "Yeah, I know," he said, grinning. "I just had to hear you say it." Keanu's laughter joined his, quiet but genuine, the sound warm against the cool night air. Then he placed a hand briefly on the musician's shoulder, a gesture that said more than any goodbye could, and began to turn away. The musician's eyes followed him, but before Keanu took his first step, he turned back one last time. "Keep the guitar ringing," he said. "One day, someone will stop to listen, and you'll understand why it mattered." The words hung between them, simple yet profound. The musician nodded, unable to speak, his heart pounding with gratitude and disbelief. As Keanu walked away, the small crowd parted to let him pass. No one shouted his name or chased after him. They just watched, silently, respectfully, as the man disappeared down the glowing street, his silhouette merging with the reflections of light and rain. For a brief, unforgettable moment, it felt as if the entire city had paused to breathe, united by a song, a stranger, and the unspoken magic of kindness. Back under the streetlight, the musician lifted his guitar again. His fingers trembled as he played the first note of a new song, one he had never written before. And though the rain fell harder now, he didn't stop. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of Keanu's footsteps faded into the night, leaving behind something far more powerful than fame, a spark of humanity that would soon ignite across millions of hearts around the world. The morning after that rain-soaked night arrived quietly, washing the city in a silver light. The streets that had shimmered under the drizzle only hours before now glowed faintly with sunrise. Somewhere downtown, a street musician named Eli, the same young man from the night before, sat on a bench outside a coffee shop, his guitar resting across his knees. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Keanu Reeves sitting beside him under that flickering streetlight, strumming his old guitar as if it were the most valuable instrument in the world. The sound still echoed in his mind, mingled with disbelief and wonder. He had replayed the scene again and again, not for the fame, not for the thrill of having played alongside a celebrity, but for the warmth he'd felt in that moment. It was the first time in months he'd felt truly seen. He opened the guitar case to count what little he'd earned the night before. A few crumpled bills, some loose change, and a single folded note that hadn't been there before. His brow furrowed. The paper was thick, the kind used for letters, not tips. Curious, Eli unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was clean and steady. From one dreamer to another. "Never stop playing. The world needs your light." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He knew. The simple kindness of those words made his chest tighten. Then, as he lifted the paper, something else slipped out from beneath it, a folded check. He blinked, thinking it must be a mistake. But when he looked closer, his breath caught. It was made out to him, Eli Matthews, for $10,000. He stared at it for a long time, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. $10,000. That was more than he'd made in the last 6 months combined. He looked around instinctively, half expecting someone to appear and say it was all some elaborate prank. But the street was empty except for the hum of the morning crowd. He ran his thumb over the ink, still faintly smudged as if it had been written in the rain. Then he laughed, not the kind of laugh born from humor, but the kind that slips out when the universe does something too beautiful to make sense. Eli closed his eyes, the memory of Keanu's calm voice echoing again. "Keep the guitar ringing." The meaning of those words hit him differently now. This wasn't just money. It was a message, a lifeline, a reminder that even when life feels unbearably small, someone out there still believes in you. For the first time in years, Eli felt a door open inside him. He packed up the guitar with trembling hands and started walking. Across town, Keanu Reeves was sitting alone in a quiet cafe, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. He had pulled up the hood of his jacket, as he always did when he wanted anonymity, but there was a softness in his face that morning, the kind that comes after a long-awaited peace. He wasn't thinking about the news, or the internet, or the millions of strangers who might one day learn about what had happened. He was thinking about the look in that young musician's eyes, the same look he'd had himself once, standing in the glow of city lights with nothing but a guitar and a dream. Keanu had left the note and the check quietly after the crowd had dispersed. He didn't want to thank you. He didn't even want to be remembered. What mattered to him was the spark, that fragile human connection that can change the trajectory of someone's life. He had been on the receiving end of it once, long ago, when someone had believed in him at his lowest point. This was simply him returning the light. Hours later, the first video from the night before began to surface online. A bystander had filmed the entire thing. The moment Keanu took the guitar, the duet beneath the rain, the silent nod before he disappeared into the mist. The clip spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was trending across every platform. Keanu Reeves sings with street musician in Los Angeles. People were mesmerized, not just by the act, but by the purity of it. There was no script, no production, no staged generosity, just two strangers creating something real. Meanwhile, Eli sat in his small apartment staring at his phone as the notifications poured in. His name was suddenly everywhere. Music blogs were trying to find him. Talk shows were reaching out. Local radio stations were replaying the audio from a viral clip, marveling at how two completely different lives had intersected in one unplanned moment of beauty. But through all the chaos, Eli kept the note folded carefully in his pocket. The money would help, sure, but it was the message that mattered most. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Eli returned to the same street corner. The flickering light was still broken. The pavement still smelled faintly of rain. He opened his case, tuned his guitar, and began to play. Not for fame, not for the cameras that now lingered at a distance, but for himself, for her, for him. For anyone who had ever stood on the edge of giving up and needed a reason not to. The first song he played wasn't the one from the night before. It was new, a melody born from gratitude. He called it Streetlight Song. And though he didn't know it yet, within days it would reach millions. His performance would be featured on morning shows, and people would quote the line from Keanu's note, "The world needs your light." Back in his apartment, Keanu watched a short clip of Eli playing that song. There was no vanity in his expression, only quiet satisfaction. He smiled faintly, took a sip of his coffee, and turned off the screen. The world could have its story. He had already lived the real one. Before he left, he scribbled a line on a napkin and tucked it under his empty cup. It read, "Sometimes the smallest act creates the loudest echo." Then, with his usual unassuming grace, he walked out into the cooling twilight, another man among millions, the glow of streetlights stretching across the city like threads of connection, binding strangers together through the simple, timeless magic of kindness. The world has a strange way of catching fire when a moment of truth cuts through the noise. Within 48 hours, the video of Keanu Reeves playing guitar with Eli had reached nearly every corner of the internet. It wasn't just trending, it was transcendent. People didn't share it for the celebrity factor. They shared it because it made them feel. It reminded them that in a world obsessed with attention, there are still acts that come from the quiet, selfless parts of the human soul. Across continents and languages, comments flooded social media. This gave me hope. I'm crying at 2 a.m. watching this. Maybe kindness isn't dead after all. Thousands of musicians began uploading their own duets in the same spirit, calling it the Streetlight Challenge. Each video started with the sound of a single note under a street lamp. Some in New York, some in Tokyo, others in small towns with names the internet had never heard before. And every time they played, someone somewhere smiled. Eli watched it all unfold from his small apartment, overwhelmed. It didn't feel real. One day, he was another face lost in the crowd, another dreamer wondering if he should quit. The next, he was being called the musician who played with Keanu Reeves. Reporters called his phone non-stop. Offers rolled in. A manager wanted to sign him. Talk shows wanted interviews. But amidst the whirlwind, Eli stayed grounded. He still woke up early, still played on the same corner, still carried that note in his pocket. Fame didn't change his music, it deepened it. One afternoon, as he was about to leave for another gig, he received an email from a local charity. It was a youth music program struggling to stay open due to lack of funding. They had seen his story and wondered if he'd perform at their small benefit concert, unpaid, purely to inspire the kids. He didn't hesitate. He agreed instantly. The night of the event, the venue was modest, a gymnasium filled with folding chairs and handmade posters that read, "Music can heal." As Eli took the stage, the audience was small but eager. The children watched him with wide, sparkling eyes. Some clutched cheap plastic recorders or second-hand violins. Others just listened, their legs swinging from their seats. When Eli began to play "Streetlight" song, a hush fell over the room. His voice, soft but steady, filled the space like a prayer. By the time the last note faded, half the audience was wiping their eyes. Afterward, a little girl with a cracked ukulele approached him shyly. "Mr. Eli," she said, tugging at her sleeve, "did you really play with John Wick?" He laughed softly. "Yeah," he said, crouching to meet her eyes. But that night wasn't about him being a movie star. It was about music and believing in yourself when nobody else does. The girl nodded seriously, then held out her ukulele. "It's missing a string," she whispered, "but I still play." Eli smiled, took the instrument gently, and strummed a single chord. It buzzed unevenly, but the sound, that imperfect human sound, filled his chest with warmth. He handed it back. "Never stop," he said, "because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear you." That moment, captured by a volunteer photographer, would later become one of the most shared images online. The street musician crouched beside a little girl, both smiling under the flicker of gymnasium lights. The caption read, "The echo of kindness continues." Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves stayed far from the spotlight. He didn't speak publicly about the video or the story. When reporters asked, he simply smiled and said, "It was just a song." But those close to him knew it had touched him deeply. His team quietly confirmed that he had donated to several struggling art programs in Los Angeles under an anonymous name. No press releases, no grand gestures, just quiet acts of good, the kind he believed mattered most. One evening, months after that first rainy night, Eli received a plain brown envelope in his mailbox. No return address. Inside was a small Polaroid photograph, a blurry shot of the two of them under that same streetlight, both mid-song, both smiling. On the back, written in familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words: "Keep the light burning." Eli felt a lump rise in his throat. He framed the photo and hung it above his desk. That night, he wrote a new song, slower, softer, more intimate. He called it "The Light Burns Still." It wasn't meant for the charts or the fans. It was a thank you, a love letter to that moment, and to the man who had given it meaning. When he performed it for the first time during a small televised concert, he ended with a message. Sometimes a stranger's kindness can change your entire world. So if you ever find yourself under a streetlight with a song in your heart, play it. You never know who might stop to listen. The audience rose to their feet in quiet applause. Among them sat a man in a worn leather jacket, his face hidden beneath a cap, his eyes glistening. He clapped softly, then slipped out before anyone noticed. Outside, he paused beneath the glow of a nearby street lamp, listening as the sound of music drifted faintly from the building behind him. A gentle smile crossed his lips. The rain began again, light and steady, like a curtain falling at the end of a play. Keanu pulled his hood up, tilted his face toward the sky, and whispered under his breath, "You kept it burning." Then, with the same quiet grace that had defined his every act, he walked away into the shimmering night. And somewhere, miles away, in countless cities and towns, musicians strummed beneath streetlights, children practiced their instruments, and strangers smiled at each other, all carrying the same invisible thread of that one ordinary night that became extraordinary. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness doesn't end, it echoes forever.